At 7 o'clock on April 29, 1945, Private First Class Desmond Doss crouched at the base of a towering cliff on the island of Okinawa, listening to the sounds of men dying above him. The cliff rose nearly 400 feet into the sky, a jagged wall of limestone known to American soldiers as Hacksaw Ridge. Somewhere at the top of that escarpment, Japanese machine guns were already firing, cutting down the first wave of American infantry trying to climb into the fight. Doss was 26 years old. He had served in 3 combat campaigns across the Pacific, and he carried no weapon. The Japanese had spent years preparing this position. The Maeda Escarpment, as it was known on military maps, had been transformed into a fortress long before the American invasion began. Machine gun nests were hidden among the rocks. Mortar positions were carefully ranged to strike every possible approach. Beneath the surface, a maze of tunnels connected dozens of reinforced bunkers. Soldiers could appear suddenly from underground openings, fire, and disappear again before American troops could react. To reach them, the Americans had only one option. They had to climb. Cargo nets hung against the cliff face, dangling over the edge like ropes thrown down into a trap. The climb began along a steep slope that rose more than 360 feet, then ended in a final 35-foot vertical wall of rock. Every soldier who climbed those nets would be fully exposed. Every one of them would become a target. Doss had arrived on Okinawa with B Company, 307th Infantry Regiment, part of the 77th Infantry Division. By the time his unit reached Hacksaw Ridge, another company had already tried to take the position. A company had attacked first. The result had been catastrophic. Japanese fire from the escarpment had nearly annihilated them. The survivors had been pulled back and folded into B Company for another attempt. Everyone understood the mathematics of the situation. The cliff was nearly impossible to assault. The defenders had perfect elevation, and the attackers would have to climb directly into the kill zone. But Desmond Doss carried an additional burden the other soldiers could not understand. He carried no rifle, no pistol, no bayonet, no weapon of any kind. In his hands he held only a medic's kit, and many of the men around him had spent 3 years trying to get him out of the army. It had begun at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in 1942. Doss came from Lynchburg, Virginia, where he had grown up in a devout Seventh-day Adventist family. His faith shaped every decision he made. His religion forbade killing. It also forbade working on the Sabbath, which he observed on Saturdays. When he entered basic training and refused to touch a rifle, the reaction was immediate. Other recruits mocked him openly. To them, a soldier without a weapon was worse than useless. He was a liability. They called him a coward hiding behind religion. At night, while Doss knelt beside his bunk to pray, boots were sometimes thrown across the barracks at him. The insults grew harsher as training continued. One soldier made a promise loud enough for everyone to hear. "When we get into combat," he said, "I'll make sure Doss doesn't come back alive." Even some of his commanding officers believed he had no place in the army. They attempted to have him discharged for mental instability. When that failed, they tried to bring him up on court-martial charges for refusing to handle a weapon. The charges eventually collapsed, but the message remained clear. No one trusted Desmond Doss. No one believed a man who refused to carry a gun could survive in combat. Despite the hostility, Doss deployed with the 307th Infantry Regiment to the Pacific. In 1944, he served as a combat medic during the brutal fighting on Guam. The men who had once threatened him began to notice something unexpected. When bullets started flying, the quiet medic from Virginia did not hesitate. He ran toward the wounded while others ran for cover. Under enemy fire, he dragged injured soldiers out of exposed positions and carried them back to safety. Bullets struck the dirt around his boots while he worked. He never slowed down. For his actions on Guam, Doss received a Bronze Star for valor. Then he earned another Bronze Star during the campaign in the Philippines. By the time the 77th Infantry Division reached Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the threats against him had stopped. The men who had doubted him had seen what he would do for them. But respect did not change the reality of the battlefield. On Hacksaw Ridge, medics were priority targets. Japanese soldiers had been trained to shoot medical personnel first. Killing the medics meant the wounded would die slowly, and the morale of the enemy would collapse. Doss would be climbing that cliff with nothing but bandages, morphine, and faith. The assault was scheduled for the following morning. Doss understood exactly what waited at the top. Intelligence reports estimated thousands of Japanese soldiers dug into caves and tunnels across the plateau. Machine guns covered nearly every approach. Mortar crews had already ranged the cargo net positions. Anyone who climbed the ridge would be walking into a storm of steel. But Doss possessed one small advantage the other soldiers did not. During training at Fort Jackson, he had learned a knot. Or rather, he had invented one by accident. While attempting to tie a standard bowline knot, he had made a mistake that produced 2 loops instead of 1. His instructors laughed at the error, but Doss remembered the method. The doubled rope created 2 secure loops. One could support a wounded man under the arms. The other could cradle his legs. The knot would not slip under weight, and it would not tighten enough to cut off circulation. One man could use it to lower another person safely down a cliff. Doss practiced tying it again and again whenever he had spare time. The other soldiers joked about it. But sometimes mistakes become innovations. The night before the assault, Doss sat quietly beside his gear. Inside his medical kit were bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syringes, and plasma bottles. Next to it lay a single coil of rope. By morning, he would be climbing into the most heavily defended position on Okinawa. The men around him checked rifles and grenades. Desmond Doss carried faith, and a knot everyone had once laughed at. At dawn on May 2, 1945, the cargo nets were thrown over the edge of Hacksaw Ridge. B Company, along with the battered survivors of a company, began the climb. Doss gripped the rough rope netting and pulled himself upward. His medical bag hung across his chest, swaying with every movement. Above him, soldiers climbed with M1 rifles strapped across their backs. Doss climbed with empty hands. The ascent took nearly an hour. Japanese machine gunners remained silent at first, waiting patiently for the Americans to reach the top. When the first soldiers pulled themselves over the edge of the escarpment, the ambush began. Artillery shells exploded across the plateau. Mortar rounds walked through the American positions. Machine guns opened fire from hidden bunkers. Men who had survived the climb were cut down within seconds. The plateau itself stretched roughly 300 yards across, a landscape shattered by explosions. Shell craters pocked the ground. Trees lay broken and splintered, and rocks concealed entrances to the Japanese tunnel system beneath the ridge. Enemies appeared and vanished like ghosts. Every shadow might hide a soldier. Every crater might contain a machine gun. Through this chaos, Desmond Doss moved without a weapon. His mission was simple: find the wounded, stop the bleeding, keep them alive. But accomplishing that task was anything but simple. Japanese snipers targeted anyone wearing the Red Cross armband that identified medical personnel. Before the assault began, Doss had removed his medic insignia. Now he looked like any other infantryman. It meant the enemy could not easily single him out. The first casualty he reached had taken shrapnel to the abdomen. Doss pressed bandages against the wound and sprinkled sulfa powder to prevent infection. The firefight around them made evacuation impossible, so he memorized the soldier's position before moving on. Then he found another wounded man, and another, and another. By midday, the plateau was covered with injured Americans. Some still clutched their rifles. Others could not move at all. Japanese mortars had already ranged the cargo net positions below the cliff. Any soldier attempting to climb back down became an easy target. The wounded were trapped on top of the escarpment. Doss began counting them as he worked. 15 wounded, then 20, then 25. Many of the other medics were already dead or pinned down by fire. Doss was the only medic still moving freely across the battlefield. His 145-pound frame made him a smaller target, and without a rifle or ammunition weighing him down, he could move faster than the infantrymen around him. But the situation grew worse as the afternoon dragged on. Japanese reinforcements emerged from hidden tunnels behind the American lines. Machine guns began firing from positions the soldiers thought had already been cleared. The enemy was everywhere, and nowhere. They appeared, fired, and vanished back underground. By evening, the company commander made a grim decision. The Americans could not hold the plateau overnight. Japanese infiltrators would hunt them down in the darkness. The order came to withdraw. The able-bodied soldiers began climbing back down the cargo nets. But dozens of wounded men remained on the ridge. Desmond Doss watched the retreat begin. He knew what happened to American prisoners captured by Japanese forces. Torture, execution, bodies mutilated and left as warnings. Many of the wounded soldiers lying across the plateau were the same men who had mocked him during training, the same men who had thrown boots at him, the same men who had called him a coward. Desmond Doss did not follow the retreat. Instead, he stayed behind on the escarpment, alone, unarmed, surrounded by enemy soldiers emerging from their tunnels. And he had only one tool left, a rope. The first wounded soldier, Desmond Doss, reached weighed nearly twice as much as he did. The man had been hit by machine gun fire. Both of his legs were shattered. He could not stand. He could not crawl. Left where he lay, he would either bleed to death on the plateau or be found by Japanese patrols sweeping the ridge after dark. Doss quickly understood the problem. There was only one way off Hacksaw Ridge, and it was straight down. He grabbed the coil of rope from his medic pack and searched along the cliff edge until he found something that might hold. Near the lip of the escarpment stood a broken tree stump, blasted and splintered by artillery fire, but still anchored firmly in the rocky soil. It would have to do. Working quickly, Doss wrapped the rope around the stump twice to create friction. Then he tied the knot he had practiced so many times during training. The double bowline. 2 loops formed at the end of the rope. One would cradle the wounded man beneath his arms. The other would support his legs. Doss dragged the injured soldier across the rough ground toward the cliff edge. The man groaned in pain with every movement, but there was no other choice. Carefully, Doss secured him in the rope harness. Then he began lowering him down. The rope slid through his hands as the soldier's weight pulled against the anchor. The coarse manila fibers burned against his palms. Slowly, foot by foot, he fed the line downward. 35 feet below the plateau, the cliff face dropped almost vertically. The wounded man scraped against the limestone as he descended, bouncing lightly against the rock wall. Doss could not see the bottom in the darkness. He could only feel the tension in the rope and hope the knot would hold. Then suddenly the rope slackened. Hands below had caught the soldier. Medics waiting at the base of the cliff pulled him free from the harness. Doss immediately hauled the rope back up, hand over hand, and went looking for the next wounded man. The second evacuation went faster. Now that he understood how much rope to release and how to control the descent, his movements became smoother. The third rescue revealed a new problem. His hands were bleeding. The rope had stripped the skin from his palms. With every descent, the fibers cut deeper into the raw flesh. By the fourth evacuation, the rope was slick with his own blood. Doss tore strips from his undershirt and wrapped them around his hands before continuing. He could not afford to stop. For now, the darkness still protected him. The Japanese had not yet realized what he was doing. Across the plateau, wounded soldiers lay scattered over 300 yards of shattered battlefield. Some had crawled into shell craters seeking shelter. Others lay exposed among broken equipment and bodies. Doss had to find them first, then drag them to the cliff. Secure them in the rope harness. Lower them down. Pull the rope back up. And begin again. Each cycle took 15 to 20 minutes. Find a casualty. Treat the wound as best he could. Drag the soldier to the edge. Tie the harness. Lower him down. Haul the rope back. Start over. The physical strain was enormous. Doss had not eaten since morning. He had been awake for more than 20 hours. After each descent, his arms trembled with exhaustion. But he kept moving. By midnight, he had already lowered more than a dozen soldiers to safety. His hands were now strips of raw flesh wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. His shoulders burned from hauling the rope upward again and again. Yet there were still wounded men he had not reached. Some were hidden in deep shell craters. Others lay in shallow depressions where they had crawled to escape Japanese patrols. Doss moved through the darkness like a ghost, feeling across the ground for bodies, listening for breathing or faint cries for help. But his success had begun to create a new danger. The Japanese had noticed. Wounded Americans who had been lying helpless on the plateau were disappearing. Enemy patrols began searching the ridge. Somewhere above them, someone was removing prisoners. They just hadn't found him yet. At one point, Doss heard voices close by. Japanese soldiers. He flattened himself against the ground, barely daring to breathe. A patrol passed less than 20 yards away. Flashlights swept across the shattered plateau as the soldiers searched for movement. If they found him, he had no weapon, no way to defend himself. He could only wait. The patrol continued moving north along the escarpment. Only after their lights vanished into the darkness did Doss dare move again. But now every rescue carried new risk. The Japanese were alert. They would be watching the cliff, listening for the scrape of rope against stone. Near a destroyed machine gun position, he found another wounded soldier. The man had been hit by shrapnel across the chest and abdomen. He was conscious, but far too weak to move. Doss began dragging him toward the cliff. The ground was uneven, littered with debris from artillery blasts. 50 yards. 40. 30. Suddenly a flare shot into the sky from the Japanese lines. White phosphorus light exploded across the battlefield. Doss froze. He was completely exposed. 30 yards from the cliff edge, with a wounded soldier in his arms, and the entire plateau illuminated like daylight. The flare burned above them for nearly 30 seconds. Doss pressed his face into the dirt and did not move. The wounded soldier beneath him groaned softly. Any sound could bring Japanese rifle fire. Doss placed his bloody hand gently over the man's mouth and waited. Across the plateau, Japanese soldiers scanned the terrain. Their silhouettes moved against the blinding white light. They were searching, looking for movement, looking for the American who had been stealing their prisoners. Finally, the flare sputtered and died. Darkness returned. Doss counted silently to 60 before he began moving again. By now his arms had stopped shaking. They had gone numb. Pain had passed into something beyond feeling. He was operating purely on instinct. Find the wounded. Drag them to the edge. Lower them down. Repeat. The original evacuation point was no longer safe. Doss noticed Japanese soldiers moving around the shattered tree stump where he had first anchored his rope. They had discovered it. They understood exactly how the Americans were disappearing. If he tried to lower another soldier there, they would be waiting. He needed another anchor point. Crawling along the edge of the escarpment, Doss searched for a new position. The ridge was uneven. Some sections dropped straight down. Others had jagged ledges that would snag a descending body. Finally, he found a small rock formation protruding from the edge about 50 yards south of the stump. It was smaller, but it was solid. Doss tested it by pulling with his full weight. The rock did not shift. He wrapped the rope around its base and prepared for another evacuation. The wounded soldier he had been dragging still lay 30 yards away. Doss crawled back across the plateau to retrieve him. Every yard felt like a mile. His knees were torn and bleeding from crawling across rubble. Bloody handprints marked the ground behind him. The cost of each rescue was mounting faster than his body could endure. But he kept going. 20 yards to the cliff. 15. 10. Another flare burst overhead. Doss froze again. This time the light illuminated his original evacuation point. He watched Japanese soldiers studying the tree stump. They examined the rope marks in the bark, the disturbed ground where bodies had been dragged. They understood now. Someone had been lowering wounded Americans off the cliff all night. And now they would be hunting him. The flare died. Darkness returned once more. Doss secured the wounded soldier in the rope harness and lowered him down from the new anchor point. The rope went slack. He pulled it back up again. His shoulders screamed with every movement. The muscles in his forearms cramped painfully. He had been working for more than 6 hours without rest. And dawn was coming. Soon the darkness would disappear. Japanese patrols would see him clearly. Every movement across the plateau would be visible. Every trip to the cliff edge would become a death sentence. Doss paused briefly to calculate the numbers. He had already lowered somewhere between 30 and 40 men. But there were still more. He could hear them. Weak voices calling for help. Moans of pain drifting across the battlefield. The casualties from the assault had been far greater than anyone expected. The mathematics were impossible. Each rescue took 15 to 20 minutes. Dawn was less than 2 hours away. Even if he worked without stopping, he could only save a handful more. The rest would remain on the plateau when daylight came. Left for the Japanese. Doss knelt in the darkness beside the cliff. For the first time all night, he stopped moving. He began to pray. Not a long prayer. Just a simple request repeated over and over. He was one man. 145 pounds. No weapon. Bleeding hands. Exhausted beyond measure. And somewhere on that plateau, wounded Americans were still waiting to die. Quietly, he whispered the same words into the darkness. Lord, help me get one more. Then he stood up and went back to work. Dawn broke over Hacksaw Ridge at 0547 on May 3rd. The first sunlight revealed a plateau covered in destruction. Shell craters. Shattered equipment. Bodies of American and Japanese soldiers scattered across 300 yards of battlefield. And at the edge of the cliff, one medic still working. Desmond Doss had never stopped. Through the entire night, he had repeated the same pattern. Find the wounded, drag them to the edge, tie the double bowline, lower them down, pull the rope back up. Again, and again, and again. Hours earlier, his hands had stopped bleeding. Now they were simply numb, but the rope still moved. And another soldier descended slowly towards safety. By the time the first sunlight began creeping across the shattered plateau of Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss's hands no longer felt like hands at all. The wounds across his palms had hardened into thick scabs during the night. Each time he gripped the rope, the scabs split open again, bleeding fresh against the rough fibers. But the pain had stopped registering. After hours of exhaustion, his body had moved beyond pain and into something else entirely. Now he felt only one thing: the weight of each man descending towards safety. The sunrise should have ended everything. Daylight meant exposure. Japanese snipers hidden among the rocks could now see every movement on the escarpment. Mortar crews could easily track his position. Machine gun teams had clear lines of fire along the cliff edge where the evacuations were happening. Under normal circumstances, the moment daylight arrived would have been the moment Doss died. But something strange happened. As the sun rose over Okinawa and light spread across the battlefield, the Japanese guns remained silent. No rifle shots cracked across the ridge. No mortars fell. No machine guns opened fire. Throughout the long night, the enemy soldiers had been watching. They had seen the lone American medic crawling across the plateau, dragging wounded soldiers across shattered ground. They had watched him lift men twice his size, tie them into the rope harness, and lower them down the cliff. They had watched him work for hours without rest, without weapons, without any apparent concern for his own survival. Some accounts later suggested the Japanese held their fire out of respect for what they had witnessed. Others believed the chaos of their own defensive lines simply prevented a clear shot. The truth was never fully known. What mattered was this: Desmond Doss kept working. By 700 hours, he had already lowered more than 50 soldiers down the cliff. The medics at the base of the ridge had stopped trying to count. In the growing daylight, wounded Americans continued appearing at the bottom of the cargo nets, descending slowly in a rope harness from somewhere above. Below the escarpment, medics worked frantically, treating the injured as quickly as they could. None of them yet understood what was happening above them. They assumed multiple rescue teams were operating on the plateau. No one imagined a single man was responsible. Doss continued searching the battlefield. Near the eastern edge of the ridge, he found another wounded soldier lying inside a shallow foxhole. The man had crawled there during the night before losing consciousness from blood loss. His breathing was faint, barely there. Doss quickly checked his pulse, applied fresh bandages, and lifted him onto his shoulders before beginning the long journey back to the evacuation point. It was nearly 80 yards across open ground. In full daylight, Japanese soldiers could see him clearly now, but still they did not fire. The wounded man weighed more than 190 pounds. Doss weighed 145. The physics made no sense. A smaller man should not have been able to drag a larger man across broken ground after working all night without food or rest. Yet he did it. By that point, Doss had moved beyond normal human limits. He operated on something deeper than strength, something that could not be measured. Each time he lowered another soldier over the cliff, he repeated the same words quietly to himself. Just one more. Then he went back to search again. By 900 hours, the numbers continued climbing. 60 men, then 65, then 70. At the base of the cliff, soldiers began realizing what was happening. The wounded arriving at the aid station had all come from the same rope harness. One medic, no weapon, working through the entire night. The men who had once thrown boots at Desmond Doss during basic training were now being carried to safety by the same hands that had never held a rifle. The final rescue came just before 1,000 hours. Doss located the last wounded soldier he could find still alive on the plateau. Slowly, with the last strength left in his body, he dragged the man to the cliff edge. He tied the harness, lowered him down, waited until the rope went slack. Then he pulled the rope back up one final time. When it reached the top, Desmond Doss collapsed beside the cliff. His arms refused to move. His legs would not respond. He lay there on the ground, completely exposed against the skyline. Any Japanese sniper could have ended his life with a single shot. None did. The final number would be debated for years. Doss himself believed he had saved around 50 men. His commanding officer believed the number was closer to 100. Eventually, military records settled on a compromise: 75 men. But the exact number hardly mattered. What mattered was the fact that a single unarmed medic had rescued nearly an entire company of wounded soldiers from a battlefield that should have been a death trap. Below the escarpment, soldiers stared upward toward the ridge. They could see the small figure of Doss lying motionless near the edge of the cliff. Word began spreading through the battalion. The conscientious objector, the man they had called a coward, the soldier they had once tried to have discharged for mental instability. He had just saved them all. The only question now was whether anyone higher than Private First Class would believe it. But Desmond Doss's war was far from over. After resting a few hours at the base of the ridge and eating his first meal in more than 30 hours, he climbed the cargo nets again. The battle for the Maeda escarpment continued. Japanese forces still occupied the tunnel network beneath the ridge. American casualties continued to mount, and B Company still needed its medic. News of the night's rescues spread quickly through the 307th Infantry Regiment. Soldiers who had not witnessed the event heard the story from those who had. 75 men lowered down the cliff by a single unarmed medic. The same man who had refused to touch a rifle during training. The same man who had been mocked and threatened by his own unit. What he had done seemed impossible. But the days that followed proved the rescues had not been a single miracle. They were part of a pattern. On May 2nd, Doss ran through heavy rifle and mortar fire to reach a wounded soldier nearly 200 yards forward of American lines. He dragged the man back across open ground that should have killed them both. 2 days later, 4 American soldiers were wounded while attacking a Japanese cave position. The enemy bunker was less than 8 yards away. Grenades poured from the cave entrance. No one could reach the wounded without crossing through the barrage. Doss crossed anyway. He moved through exploding grenades, treated the men where they lay, and carried each one back to safety in separate trips. On May 5th, the fighting intensified again. An American artillery officer was severely wounded during a barrage. Doss crawled through shell fire to reach him, applied bandages, and administered plasma while mortar rounds exploded nearby. Later that same day, another soldier was shot near a Japanese cave entrance and fell 25 feet down a slope. Enemy riflemen could see anyone who approached. Doss crawled forward anyway. He treated the wounded man under direct fire and then carried him 100 yards back to safety. It became impossible to ignore the pattern. Doss had not simply performed one heroic act on Hacksaw Ridge. He was performing them every day. Every battle produced more wounded soldiers. And every day the unarmed medic went places no armed soldier would go. He rescued men others believed were already lost. Within weeks, his reputation changed completely. The same soldiers who had once doubted him now requested him specifically. When patrols went forward, they asked for Doss. When assaults were planned, commanders asked if the medic from B Company would be there. The man the army had once tried to discharge had become the most trusted soldier in the regiment. Other medics studied his methods. The double bowline knot he had invented became widely discussed. His decision to remove the Red Cross insignia to avoid being targeted spread among other medical personnel. His habit of memorizing wounded soldiers' locations before returning for evacuation became a model for battlefield triage. Meanwhile, officers began documenting everything. Reports moved upward through the chain of command. Company to battalion. Battalion to regiment. Regiment to division. Soon the 77th Infantry Division headquarters possessed detailed accounts of something extraordinary. A soldier who refused to carry a weapon was saving more lives than anyone who did. Witness statements accumulated. After-action reports. Medical evacuation records. Somewhere in that growing pile of paperwork was the foundation for something Desmond Doss had never asked for. The question was whether the Army would award its highest honor to a man who refused to carry its weapons. The answer would come later. First, the war had one more test for him. On the night of May 21st, 1945, Doss's unit launched an attack near Shuri. Almost immediately, the assault went wrong. Japanese soldiers were waiting. In the darkness, American troops stumbled directly into an enemy company. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the hillside. Grenades exploded. Rifles fired at point-blank range. Doss scrambled across the battlefield, treating the wounded wherever he found them. Eventually, he dropped into a shell hole with 3 other soldiers. They crouched inside the crater, waiting for the chaos around them to settle. Then suddenly a Japanese grenade landed among them. The other soldiers were positioned lower inside the crater. Desmond Doss was facing the direction the grenade had come from. He saw it arc through the darkness and drop directly into their position. There was no time. No time to shout a warning. No time to grab the grenade and throw it back. Desmond Doss saw the dark shape drop into the shell hole, felt the world compress into a single moment, and reacted on instinct. He kicked his left foot toward the spot where he believed the grenade had landed and slammed his helmet into the dirt. The explosion erupted an instant later. The blast hurled him out of the crater like a rag doll. When he hit the ground, the first thing he understood was that something was terribly wrong with his legs. 17 pieces of shrapnel had torn through his lower body. His thighs and hips were shredded. Blood soaked through his uniform almost immediately. Inside the shell hole, the 3 soldiers who had been crouching beside him were alive, unharmed. Doss had absorbed the full force of the explosion. In the darkness, he began treating himself. The same hands that had spent weeks dragging wounded soldiers across Okinawa were now working on his own body. They were barely hands anymore. Weeks of rope burns and torn skin had turned them into raw meat wrapped in bandages. Still, they moved with the practiced precision of a combat medic. He tightened tourniquets, pressed bandages into the torn flesh of his legs, slowed the bleeding as best he could. Then he waited. Rather than call for another medic and risk another man's life, Doss remained silent inside the crater. For 5 hours, he lay there alone, bleeding, listening to the distant sounds of battle gradually fading as the night moved toward dawn. After sunrise, litter bearers finally found him. They lifted him carefully onto a stretcher and began carrying him toward the aid station. The distance was long, but help was finally coming. Then the battlefield exploded again. Japanese tanks launched a counterattack. Shells crashed across the terrain. The litter team dove for cover. Doss turned his head and saw something that stopped him. Another wounded soldier lay nearby. The man was in worse shape than he was. Without hesitation, Doss rolled off the stretcher. Ignoring the agony in his shattered legs, he crawled across the dirt toward the wounded man. He dressed the soldier's wounds as quickly as he could. Then he looked up at the litter bearers. "Take him first." They hesitated, but Doss insisted. The stretcher team lifted the other soldier and disappeared toward the aid station. Desmond Doss remained behind, bleeding from 17 shrapnel wounds, waiting for them to come back. But someone else found him first. A Japanese sniper. The rifle shot cracked across the battlefield. The bullet struck Doss's wrist, tore through his elbow, and lodged in his upper arm. The bone shattered instantly. Now he had 17 pieces of shrapnel in his legs and a compound fracture in his arm. He was completely alone. No stretcher. No medics. The aid station lay roughly 300 yards away. Nearby, he noticed something lying on the ground. A broken rifle. For his entire military career, Desmond Doss had refused to touch a weapon. Now he picked it up, not to fight, but to survive. He used the rifle stock to fashion a crude splint for his shattered arm. Then he began crawling, 300 yards across rough ground, dragging his broken limb, blood leaking from wounds across his entire body. Inch by inch, yard by yard. Somehow he made it. He reached the aid station under his own power. The army initially believed he had died. News of his death reached his hometown of Lynchburg, Virginia, and made the front page of the local newspaper. But the report was wrong. Doss corrected it himself. From a hospital ship in the Pacific, he wrote a letter to his mother. He was alive. Barely. 4 months later, on October 12, 1945, Corporal Desmond Doss stood on the lawn of the White House. President Harry Truman held the Medal of Honor in his hands. The citation covered weeks of extraordinary actions between April 29th and May 21st. The rescues on the escarpment, the evacuations under fire, the assaults on Japanese caves, the grenade blast that should have killed 4 men. President Truman shook his hand and said something Doss would remember for the rest of his life. "I would rather have this honor than be president." Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor for actions in combat. The soldier who had refused to carry a weapon had earned the highest military decoration in the United States. The men of the 307th Infantry Regiment had one final gift for him. During the battle, Doss had lost the small Bible he carried everywhere. After the fighting ended, soldiers returned to the escarpment. They searched the battlefield until they found it. They brought it back to the man who had saved them all. The war left permanent scars. The shrapnel wounds healed slowly. The compound fracture in his arm required multiple surgeries. But the worst damage came from something doctors discovered later. While fighting on Okinawa, Doss had contracted tuberculosis. The infection had been spreading through his lungs during the months he crawled across Hacksaw Ridge rescuing wounded soldiers. By the time it was diagnosed, the damage was severe. Doss spent more than 5 years in army hospitals after the war. Eventually, surgeons removed one of his lungs entirely. The operation saved his life, but it left him permanently disabled. He returned to Lynchburg carrying the Medal of Honor, a Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters and 2 bronze stars. But his body would never fully recover. The man who had once dragged soldiers twice his weight across a battlefield could no longer perform heavy physical work. Yet he never complained. He moved with his wife Dorothy to a small farm in Rising Fawn, Georgia. They had married just before he shipped out to the Pacific. Dorothy had given him the Bible he carried through every battle. The same Bible his unit had searched the battlefield to recover. He kept it for the rest of his life. The farm became his quiet refuge. He worked when his body allowed, rested when it did not. He remained deeply involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the faith that had guided every decision of his military service. The beliefs that had once made him a target during basic training had also made him a hero on Okinawa. Doss never saw any contradiction between the two. For decades, he lived quietly. Occasionally, he spoke to church groups, scout troops, and students. Sometimes he demonstrated the double bowline knot he had used on Hacksaw Ridge. He never sought attention. He never wrote a memoir. Whenever people praised him, he redirected the credit toward the soldiers he served with and the God he believed had protected him. Tragedy struck again in 1991 when his wife Dorothy died in a car accident. 2 years later, he remarried. His second wife, Frances Duman, cared for him through his final years. His health gradually declined. The tuberculosis, the wounds, the broken bones, all of it accumulated into decades of chronic pain. Hollywood tried many times to tell his story. Producers approached him repeatedly. Even Audie Murphy, himself a Medal of Honor recipient and famous actor, wanted to make the film. Doss refused every offer. He did not want his story exaggerated or dramatized. He did not want actors putting words in his mouth. He waited for people he trusted. Finally, in 2004, a documentary called The Conscientious Objector introduced his story to a wider audience. In interviews, Doss spoke with the same humility he had always carried. He insisted the real heroes were the men who had never come home. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006. He was 87 years old. 10 years later, the feature film Hacksaw Ridge brought his story to millions of people around the world. The movie won Academy Awards and earned more than $180 million at the box office. Doss never saw it, but his legacy was finally known everywhere.